You can go anywhere in the Southwest or in the Midwest or in the East or the South or in the Pacific Northwest. I lived there for about 4 years, and you will always find pro-immigrant groups because it's in our culture, in our history, that massive deportations can occur at any historical time, particularly when the economy is suffering.
You have a comment? Okay.
I wanted to recommend a book, if you can find it. It's called Labor History of the Southwest.
Sure.
It was published by the University of Arizona many years ago. It's out of print now, but you can find it here and there. And it's academic papers about labor history, but it has a very, very interesting article in there about the Mondragon brothers and the organizing that took place around the copper miners. I didn't realize that there was this big network of Hispanic, Mexican organizers that traveled. They had a newspaper that they printed in St. Louis, and they threw it on a train, and it went down to Nogales, and then they'd unload it and send it to all the copper miners in Cananea and all in that area in there, and they had strikes. They would follow the railroad lines all the way up from Utah, all the way down to the mines in Mexico. They're very, very interesting stories in there and articles about the early labor history and organizing in the Southwest, both in the United States and in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with migration, some of the migrants have participated like in revolutionary movements or in union movements. So you can always, if you start working, you start meeting them. They're basically activists or progressive people.
Can I say a little bit, Manuel? Can I just talk a little bit? You got it.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd like a little bit of your input from this, but I believe that just because this purpose of this talk is to give some people some background on all this, and even though a lot of the details aren't really hard to grasp, but Proposition 187 in California was a anti Spanish language. Wasn't that a large component of the proposition?
No, there was another. There's several propositions passed in 1994, 227, I can't remember if it was 187, and the other one was to get rid of affirmative action. One was to make English only, and one was to deny services, basic services to workers around that period. It was Pete Wilson, okay? But it was to stop the flow that was coming in from Mexico. This is under the NAFTA immigration wave. But like I say, how was the resistance there on the part of immigrants? Some went back, but many just went to the Midwest or to the South or to the East.
Well, I remember that time in California because there was a lot more, even though California nowadays is seen as progressive. Back then it was pretty reactionary, and that was before Arizona became in the limelight. Isn't that correct? That California was pretty reactionary. That was there of just like you said, Pete Wilson, and those things kind of have disappeared in California. But it's really a strong element of these states. But and secondly, that I think that to remember all this, it seems like this immigration movement happens in sort of it explodes. And when I got here in about 2007, or when I started getting active, was the time that you mentioned it, but Pruitt's, and there was a lot of action going on in Phoenix. It centered around a furniture store on Thomas Road near, I guess it's 36th Street. That's where I live, and for a long period of time, there was kind of a standoff. Joe Arpaio brought a lot of this to the forefront with activists because he swore that he was hired by this company, this furniture company, to get day laborers off the corners away from his property, and that was like a standoff point.
Yeah.
So it really elevated the activism, and that really propelled forward for several years up until, well, 2010 was when SB 1070 was passed.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, there was a lot of anti-immigrant legislation, you
Yeah.
know, and there was this guy Russell Pierce,
Right.
who was the speaker of speaker of the Arizona legislature, who sponsored or who brought forward the SB 1070 and a lot of this racism. But it really elevated the activism of the whole community, and it kind of goes away after a while, even though everybody still exists. There's a lot of dissipation, and there's fragmentation also of
Mm-hmm. Yes.
ideologies and fights and such.
Correct.
So I think that's an important thing for people to understand, that this, you know, they'll hear references to almost like the good old days when, you know, when 20 or 40,000 people could assemble, you know, to stop SB 1070.
Right.
And why can't we do it today? Or you mentioned a march of 200,000 people in Phoenix. I think that was in 2006. And then there were several marches of 20 to 40,000
Yes.
people.
Mm-hmm.
So those whole things happen, but they're not happening now, and people might wonder why. And, you know, it just has to be, you know, pointed out that that's the nature of this fight, is that there seems to be a moments of really when people gather together to fight for their rights, and then they kind of just are in survival mode. That might be what's called today. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. You want to say? Can you say a little bit about that? About how that, and then of course, Joe Arpaio, how he galvanized the opposition a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's by my look. One thing about the immigration struggle, like in California, it used to be silent. There's a movie called Search for Homeland, which is a documentary on the Chicano movement. The Chicano movement was from 65 to around 79. That's basically it. Some organizations came out of that, but they cover the Vietnam War, they cover land struggle, they cover poverty, and political struggle. But they didn't cover immigration, although Bert Corona had been working on it. And in fact, he had a debate with Cesar Chavez, because one time Cesar Chavez said that they should get rid of the undocumented worker because they were becoming scabs. And Bert Corona and others debated with Cesar Chavez, and then he changed his line. Eventually, he was very supportive. So there's been a lot of fear from the 1930s to the today, defending immigrant rights, because you can get caught too. Look what they did to No More Debts and so on. So, but when the struggle is necessary, like what was happening in the 1990s and 2000s, then people come out, and then they get involved in struggle. But when you get involved, you walk among the organizers. They all have different ideologies and different lines, but at the same time, you always have one that's dominant, and that one's that leads, and you go forward. And that's what happened with Somos America. It was the main organization, but even then, for Somos America to get established, they had to push out Bermudez. And then after it was over, then the old leaders wanted to claim the leadership, and then the young ones, they were trying to get rid of Carlos Garcia inside Tona Tierra. I was involved in that. I was involved in a meeting in which they say, okay, some of these people, they're all students, they're not really active, blah, blah, we gotta get rid of them. And so, and then inside Somos America too, there was Roberto Reveles versus Carlos Garcia. And he kept, even though sometimes Roberto Reveles didn't attend the meetings, he would attack Carlos Garcia. And the reason he was opposed to Carlos Garcia is because in one of the marches, there was a demonstration close to the football stadium. And people were talking about, okay, well, let's march on to the football stadium that was being built. But there was opposition to that. And then they blamed, Roberto Rivera used to blame Carlos Garcia for being a provocateur. So, but eventually, with that leadership debate, some people supported Carlos Garcia and helped him establish Puente. And you have to also worry about that the struggle, pro-immigrant struggle in the Mexican community, Mexican-American community, is long range. You have to worry about generation after generation, and you have to pass the torch to the new generation. So I myself support Carlos Garcia because he's the future. And in fact, at one at the time I was president of South America, I was given an email to distribute and criticizing Carlos, and I feel very bad. And then after that, many people were emailing me and attacking me because I had I had attacked Juan Carlos. So that's when I resigned from Somos America. Now, if you want to get yourself involved in Somos America, you can just work with Somos America. Now they're also working with the children that are being caged, and you can get involved in there. And once you're there, you can link up to different organizations. And what happens, what's important is that you get involved. That's all. I mean, that has always been my policies. If there's a struggle and you get close to the to the struggle, to the leadership, and you contribute, and then eventually you help as much as possible if you can take a leadership position. But the struggles come and go, and they never stop. Now, I'm familiar with some of the leftists from the 60s and 70s who used to be in Students for Democratic Society. I still follow them. I have their organizations, and I follow their debates. They're still debating. Similar debates to the 1960s.
I'll finish this up because I want to let other people, I know there's a lot of things to be said.
We should hear from people under 60 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Joe, that's true. I have something to say, and I don't,
So do I. So do I. And I haven't talked yet.
Never mind then. Thank you. Thanks for clearing that up, Joe.
James, you have a question or a comment, observation?
No, you brought back a lot of memories. I grew up in Southern California, in San Diego, during the Duke Mage and Pete Wilson eras, where what was his name? B1 Bob Dornan and all these, far right-wing guys that became these images for this galvanized argument against immigration in our country. But they weren't new arguments, and these weren't new things that were happening. I studied history, and I studied history here in Arizona. And one of my last history classes was the study of the Southwest and how complicated the relationship has always been between the United States, Spain, and Mexico, even before the Civil War.
Yes.
Because we had people settled here, because California, the California Republic, people were migrating from the east to the west in the search for gold. Well, some of them didn't always make it because, like, why would I go all the way out here when I can stop here? And they were getting land grants from it was Mexico. So Mexico's like, we don't care. We don't want it anyway.
Yes.
Go up there. Take as much as you want to. Well, after the Civil War, when the whites started to move out, then things started to become a problem. It's deportation and imprisonment has always been a familiar and useful tool for the capitalist system in the United States to keep organized movements down. Even American citizens, like the founders of the IWW, were deported to the Soviet Union.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
They were born in the United States.
I know.
And then although a majority of the labor, farm laborers and unionization Cesar Chavez. We forget also of the great numbers of Filipino Americans and Japanese Americans who were working in the farms and helping to build this country. The Chinese Exclusion Act.
Correct.
They were because and it all comes down to you're not going to make more money than we are.
Correct.
You're getting too comfortable in our society, and as soon as you start to become comfortable, you have to start to learn your place again. It's never going to be legislated.
Yeah.
It's never going to be voted upon.
Yeah.
All of these organizations that you mentioned in your lecture, it's all direct action. It has to be direct action because that's all that the working class has.
Right.
We don't have the money. We don't have the support. We don't have the finances, but we've got feet, we've got hands, and a lot of us have really big mouths. And we can say, you know what? This is absolutely wrong what you're doing. You're talking about children being caged at the border.
Yeah.
There are children being caged at the border. There are women being caged at the border.
Yes.
There are men being caged at the border. They're being abused. They're being beaten, and they're being raped. Children are being raped, not molested, raped.
Yeah.
Okay. Because of this idea of making America great. That's not a great. And if that's what a great America looks like, give me the Soviet Union any day.
Yeah, the repression of immigrants, undocumented immigrants, has risen to cruelty. On the part of that's the policy basically of Trump. And we'll see what happens, and so because it's coming. That you guys are keeping up with battleground states, no? Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. There's another one, and guess who's ahead on the polls right there? Trump. And basically, his strategy is the same as in the past. I will win via the electoral college. So the struggle is tough right now. And look what happened with Mexico. They basically Trump forced them to use the National Guard to stop the migration flow. But one thing keep in mind here also is that that people in Guatemala, I think in El Salvador, their minimum wage is higher than in Mexico. So when they go to Mexico and say, we'll offer you jobs. Yeah, here's jobs. They don't want them because they'll make more money if they get to the U.S., even though they may die. So, but right now, the repression against migration, the biggest irony that this migration flow was unleashed after the Soviet Union fell because they used to stop migration, and all of a sudden it was unleashed, and the capitalist countries were super happy that all this migrant labor was coming in, but all of a sudden they want to stop it. And they say, and that's what's going on right now. They're trying to stop it. But they cannot, in the U.S., in terms of Mexico and the U.S. migration, they can't stop it. Right now, they need people to work in the fields, to work in the meat factories, and that includes Central American workers.
Do you remember when Mayor Bloomberg in New York City said, if there's no way that we could ban immigrant labor because our economy would shut down.
Oh yeah.
Our restaurants, our sanitation, hospitals. Nursing homes, everything would shut down. We're dependent on it. He said, so if your state doesn't want immigrant labor, we'll take them.
And then right now with immigration labor, there's just pure hatred from the right wing from ever since 2001, and Trump being the greatest manifestation. Look, people are unemployed. 26 million people are unemployed. How many people are lining up to pick up broccoli? Or work in the meat factories? No, it's still the same workers. No. And if they die, some of them will die in the meat factories. They're going to bring in more immigrants, undocumented immigrants, to work there. Okay, so
the whole idea of a right to work state was to keep immigrant labor and unions from organizing, and immigrant labor taking jobs away from white soldiers returning back from the war. So that's all I have to say. I think other people had something to say, but I appreciate your lecture today. Thanks.
Thank you, James.
I have a quick question. There's a lot of organizations out there. What would you recommend for us? What's the best way for us to get involved in helping, or some kind of community outreach? Which organizations would you recommend that we could link up with or work with?
Okay, now before I start, let me say, basically, when I was a little kid in LA from Boyle Heights, I used to go to movies. Well, sometimes I would walk from Boyle Heights to downtown or vice versa. I would always find a newspaper called the Weekly People, and I think it was 5 cents, and I would read it. And basically, also I supported the Civil War in Spain, the Republicans, and also I kept track of Latin Americans' struggle for independence and also for against imperialists. So when I come across and I go wherever I go, my view is socialist. So I just, okay, look, what are the socialists doing? What are the struggles going on? There may be contradictions, okay? So then I say, okay, I'm going to get close to I like the struggle that's going on. It's an immediate struggle. It may not be linked directly to the struggle between the worker and the capitalist, but I'm going to work there. So I get close and I go in at 10, and there's always friendly people. And if you keep going and working with them, they allow you to make contributions. And then if you want to acculturate within that particular group or whatever, eventually you can do it if that's your goal. And so therefore, after I left Boyle Heights, I got involved in at Los Angeles City College. I got involved with the Black Student Union. I became president of all clubs because there was building takeovers. And then I was elected president of our club. So I work with the Black Student Union. I work with the Palestinian organization, and I work with SDS, and I work with all the other groups. Okay, so in that sense, and that has always been my pattern. Wherever I go, I don't limit. So I get close to. So my suggestion here is people want to get involved in this, and people and undocumented immigrants need your help. I would go to Somos America, attend their meetings, and they have a website, and then Somos America is a coalition, and they even have one group that works with the caged children. So and eventually from there you can start linking up. No More Debts was part of Somos America. Okay, and also if you're involved with the unions and so on, you can also get them involved there. And see if they have a pro-immigrant group or section. So you can always get involved. There's many other organizations where you can get involved. But like I say, whenever you get involved with organizations, mass organizations, you just get close to them and you work with them and you help and you do what you can. And so that has been my practice. And it continues to be, and that's if you want to be active, and then that's what I recommend. And if the struggles come and go, sometimes they're low, they're high intensity, and then they crumble, then you just move on, but you just keep staying active.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And then if there's some organizations you find rejection or so, don't worry, those persons are going through changes, and so eventually their consciousness will change. So
yeah. I think we have time for one more quick question. We're supposed to wrap up at 1:30. We do have a business portion of the meeting. Does anyone else have a quick question or comment?
Yeah, if no one else, I was going to ask you about the formation of Puente, but you sort of covered it already. But I met Carlos Garcia at a meeting with the Mass Liberation Project.
Sure.
That is one of the most impressive men I've ever encountered in my life. He had so many like phone calls coming in, and like I think he was bouncing between a couple of meetings there at the community center at the same time. He has kids, just a really impressive man. But he's actually the person that told me that the NBA was shutting down at the start of this whole pandemic. That's like the last place I went before I started staying at home completely. So it was really interesting to hear you talk about him. And thank you for this presentation.
Yeah, you always have to have resilience, right? Because here is Carlos. Okay, he wants to work with the boycott that we were starting back in 2001, 2002 against Arizona. And he's inside working with Puente, and there's Salvador. He's a good friend of mine, and I love him, and I think he's a great model. But he sort of like took a position against against Carlos and some other students, and some other and so he wanted to get rid of him. And so, because one thing, there's always, when you get involved in organization, there's always purchase. And so there's different factions, and then you just got to move on. And so on. And then also he was in Somos America. He was also being pushed out or criticized heavily by Roberto Reveles. And he was resilient. He just moved on. And what happens when there's debates too, like this, and you're in leadership, you need to be resilient, because sometimes what happens, there's conflict and there's realignment. And what happens with Carlos, in the realignment, he got the support of Alfredo Gutierrez. He got the support of I can't remember his name, Daniel, lawyer. And so in that sense, because having that organization Puente is no easy thing, okay? And also the office is no easy thing, and so on. So in that sense, and by the way, some of the people, you have some dreamer who was involved after the Proposition 300. He got involved into running political campaigns. He ran Carlos's. And here's a dreamer that, no papers, no nothing, and he gets involved. And he has, and that dreamer, he specializes in that, and running political campaigns and helping some of the former activists in Somos America get a position in the in government. So once again, if you're involved, you have to be resilient. You have to keep getting involved. Don't stop. And the only thing, of course, is if you die, but that's another story. You have to stay in there.
Comment?
Yeah, Joe?
Just a comment that when Manuel was talking about 250,000 people in a demonstration in Phoenix, there were 2 million in Los Angeles that day marching.
Oh yeah.
And which is the largest demonstration in the history of the United States. But think of 250,000 in Phoenix, and it was bigger than any demonstration but one, maybe, against the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And those were national mobilizations when they brought people from all over the country. Just in Phoenix.
Yeah.
Just Phoenix in the same day. I mean, so don't ever believe it that Phoenix doesn't have potentials to have huge actions, because I think Phoenix proved that they're as radical a city as anywhere that day.
Oh yeah, no. There's a novel published in Chicago about the struggle for the pro-immigrant struggle around 2008. And at the end of the novel, it gives you a list of all the demonstrations that occurred and the number of people who participated. Joe mentioned the 2 million in LA. And I'm sure that those 2 million in LA were organized by students of Bert Corona. Yeah. So you always, Bert Corona is a historical model for the defending immigrant rights. And in fact, he's the one that got the term undocumented accepted.
We are all his students.
Yes. When it comes to the immigration struggle, yes. Yeah, because it's not going to stop. Yeah. What's happening right now? Okay, they're trying to de-emphasize Mexican workers or Central American workers. They're recruiting workers from Eastern Europe. Keep track of things. Or they're trying to recruit now. And look, where does the Trump doesn't have problem as far as immigrants? They don't come from Venezuela. They don't come from Cuba directly. They don't come from Nicaragua. All socialist countries don't send their workers. Don't encourage the workers to come to the U.S. They all come from satellites, economic satellites of the U.S., from Mexico, from Guatemala, from El Salvador, from Colombia. It's sort of like they accept the U.S. hegemony, and then they say, here's some workers, send them. So you can send us the monies to prop up our economies. But you don't have any problem of massive migration from Cuba, El Salvador, Nicaragua or Venezuela. No. Because in Venezuela, they're pushing for self-sufficiency and farm products and other stuff. Because they're under siege. So yeah, so the migration struggle doesn't stop. And Mexico does have a special relationship with the U.S. along the border. I think it's very hard for Trump to suppress what, oh yeah, not only is it $1 billion a day, but 1 million people when outside of the COVID-19, 1 million people a day cross the border, both sides. And also another thing about migration is not just totally one way. There's about 1 million Americans. When I say Americans, because they keep track of that, but when Mexico means it's Anglo-Americans, white Americans, because they keep track of flow of Mexicans when they, like in the special holidays, they go visit the family, but they keep specific track of white Americans who visit there. And so 1 million live in Mexico, different communities, and also about not on the outside of COVID situation, about 5 million tourists go back. So you have basically anywhere from 5 to 6 million white Americans in Mexico during a normal year. So in that sense, it's back and forth. And right now, the Mexican workers from the U.S., they're keeping Mexico afloat. I think they sent in what, $35 billion last year. And I think according to the president, I think in March, it increased the amount of money they sent. So, but anyway, I mean, it's not going to stop if all of a sudden the U.S. well, okay, we want immigrants now from Eastern Europe, from the countries that are supporting against Russia, or now they're going to open the doors for Venezuelans to come in, or open the door for more Colombians to come in. And basically, they come in and they go to Florida, and they're conservatives. They're pro-Trump, pro-Republican, and anti-socialist, anti-communist. So one must always be active in the migration struggle and the immigration struggle. And as far as some of the stereotypes directed at Mexican and Central American migrants, from my own readings on the U.S. and migration, is they used to use them against Italians, Greeks, it didn't matter, Germans. I mean, it's just, and then of course, once again, it's not like they really want the workers. They don't want the jobs that those workers have, like in the fields or in the meat markets or whatever. You know how many workers have died in the subway, in New York subway? 79 from COVID. The essential workers. So once again, the migration struggle, it's just there. It will continue to be there. Europe is also an excellent example of how migration has the manifestation of migration after World War II. And I think that's one of the reasons why you didn't have migration from Europe, from Western Europe, because their cities were devastated. They had to rebuild them, and they needed laborers. What did they do? They went to the ex-colonies to bring them in. And that's why you have Africans and Middle Easterns in Germany, or you have them everywhere. Some of them are still not citizens. So, and that's why they couldn't bring it. I think that's one of the reasons why there was reform in the U.S. in 1965 reform, because which opened up migration from the Western Hemisphere and from Asia, because they couldn't get workers from Europe. So they brought them from everywhere. And today is what one out of 3 Americans is a person of color.
Well, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I actually learned a lot, and I really appreciate your time coming on and giving this lecture for us. I really do.